On the home front with the military resources. So what we're looking at is the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. This was founded and run by it was founded by William Donovan and run by William Donovan. Eventually, it was the forerunner to the CIA. Again, the Anti-Espionage Department. It will become the CIA in the post-war era, the Center for Intelligence Agency. The Draft and Selective Service, we talked about the first drafts that were draft laws that were passed, date all the way back to the Civil War. The Confederates and the Union instituted the draft. We see the draft come around again during World War I. And in this situation, we have a peacetime draft that was pushed by Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall and Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and backed by FDR. Selective service, if you are 18 out there, if you're an 18-year-old male, I think we talked a little bit about selective service earlier, then you have probably already started this process. You can't have a driver's license, you can't vote, you can't file your taxes or do any of that kind of stuff without applying for your selective service. Ladies, I wouldn't be surprised if we see selective service in years to come. The women would be eligible for selective service. What this means is that it prepares the country for a potential hey, what's up? Oh, nice. Thank you very much. You're the man. Doing all right? Good. Doing great, man. Have a great day, Randy. Take care. So what selective service does is if there's a wartime or even a peacetime draft, this makes you eligible for the draft. One of the greatest pieces of policy that was ever developed during World War II, and some would argue one of the greatest pieces of policy created in the 20th century, was the GI Bill, the General Infantryman's Bill. This meant that when you signed up to serve in any branch of the service, that you could come home and the GI Bill would help pay for college, it would help pay for housing, and what this is known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. This is the reason that so many American men and women after the war were able to seek out and live the American dream. And you have young people who were either kids or teenagers during the Great Depression or were coming of age into adulthood during the Great Depression who had very little promise, very little opportunity for an education. And then they come out of World War II with this, and they have the ability to start going to college. We also see a real big boost in the enrollment in land-grant colleges. We also see the formation of new colleges as a result of the GI Bill. And did you guys remember learning about Levittown last year? It was a post-World War II subdivision that was built, like cookie cutter houses in Levittown, New York. They all kind of look the same. Do you live in or do you recognize neighborhoods in and around where we live where a lot of the houses look the same?
Yeah.
Sure we do. Okay. So for example, my wife and I on the West End for a time lived in a neighborhood that was built in the post-war era. So all of the houses sat like every house sat on a quarter acre, every house looked pretty much the same. That's something that the GI Bill inspired because that meant you could buy affordable housing in the post-war era. Something I do want to point out though is that there needs to be a comment on the the fact that a lot of African Americans were left out of the picture on the GI Bill. They obtained the GI Bill. They were able to go to some colleges, not all, mostly historic black colleges and colleges that were integrated like Oberlin and some of the Ivies by this time. Remember, a lot of the state schools, like even southern schools like University of Virginia at this time, was not integrated. So another issue too is a lot of African Americans have a very difficult time being able to use their GI Bill for housing. And NPR actually did a podcast on this, I think within the last year. They talked about the issue that the deck was stacked against African American veterans coming back from World War II, trying to take advantage of the GI Bill. So I wanted to point that out as well. Top right, that's the seal for the OSS. Bottom right, that's the insignia of their patch. So do you guys get the reference to this? The tip of the spear. Have you ever heard of that reference? Like they're the sharpest, right? Get it? Their intelligence. All right, so a lot of our OSS operatives were trained in Canadian facilities by British Secret Intelligence, M16, and Canadian Intelligence. The facility that they most were trained at was known as Camp X. It's a pretty cool documentary about the operatives being trained at Camp X by intelligence, code breakers, spies, commandos. It's kind of, their training was pretty crazy. OSS played a major role in training troops in China and in Burma. Bless you. Other activities that the OSS got involved in, they helped arm, train, and supply resistance movements in France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands. They assisted commandos in clandestine operations throughout Europe. Do keep in mind that the British intelligence and the British commandos, their intelligence operations started as early as 1940. The OSS also recruited and set up some of the war's most important spies. America's most important spy, hands down, was German diplomat Fritz Kolb. Has anybody ever heard of Fritz Kolb before? He's tremendously important. We're actually going to break down why Fritz Kolb is considered America's most important spy during World War II, or arguably America's most important spy, period. Other notable OSS spies included Julia Child, the famous baker and chef, and legendary Red Sox catcher Mo Berg. Other functions of the OSS included propaganda campaigns, espionage, subversion, post-war planning. I should also say cipher and code breaking, but do keep in mind that a lot of the code breaking was done by Army and Navy intelligence, and the OSS didn't really, they worked with the Army and Navy intelligence, but they weren't under their umbrella necessarily. The OSS purchased Soviet code and cipher material from Finland. They worked with British Intelligence Service, M16, the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS. One of the greatest accomplishments of the OSS was wartime penetration of Nazi Germany by our operatives. And then the OSS is responsible for training German and Austrians for missions inside Germany. Men, women, these were very important clandestine operatives during the war. Let's talk a little bit about Fritz Kolb, codenamed George Wood. By the end of the war, he had passed along nearly 2,600 documents. He was later described by the Central Intelligence Agency as the most important spy of World War II. George Wood was not only our best source on Germany, but undoubtedly one of the best secret agents any intelligence service has ever had. That's from Allen Dulles, the founder of the CIA. And then we have some of Fritz Kolb's major accomplishments. The German expectations of the site of the D-Day landings at Calais, the V-1, V-2 buzz bomb programs, information about the German development of the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, Japanese plans in Southeast Asia, and then he exposed the German agent Cirio, who was working as a butler in the British embassy in Turkey. So again, Fritz Kohl, pretty important guy that is a bit of an unsung hero in World War II history, at least for the American Allied side. A couple of other OSS spies, Julia Child here. Familiar with Julia Child? Hello. She's a very famous chef and baker. She's like one of the first people to have like a baking show, and I feel like that's pretty common now. There's probably significant double-digit number of cooking shows, and she's one of the first. And then on the right we have Moe Berg. That is a selective service draft card from World War II. That is the seal of the selective service system. So keep in mind, everything has obviously been retooled, but this provides more opportunity for women and minorities. Also keep in mind that women and minorities still had to deal with a great deal of prejudice, and also not, even though they gained new opportunities, those opportunities weren't necessarily equal and they were scrutinized. So whether it was African Americans, women, African American women, Latinos, they faced some pretty difficult hardships. Women ordnance worker here on the right. Most women worked in the labor force in some capacity, but there was also women that were in non-combat military roles, like the Women's Army Corps. They served as nurses, secretaries, and really non-stop service. The WACs, this was the name for the Women's Army Corps. The WAVES was the Women's Naval Corps. The WASP was the Women's Air Corps, and the MCWR was the Marine Corps Women's Reserves. So every branch of the military had women serving. Some of the women, I think it's important to point out the WASP, some of those women got sucked into combat, whether they were in bomber, like cargo plane, they were in cargo planes, if they were in gliders, some of these women did get sucked into combat. Rosie the Riveter becomes the symbol for women working in the labor force. Are you guys familiar with Norman Rockwell, famous American artist? You guys have probably seen some Norman Rockwell paintings, like if you've gone to a doctor's office, doctors typically have like the old school Norman Rockwell doctor paintings. Has anybody ever seen like the iconic one with the grandmother delivering the turkey for Thanksgiving and everybody sitting around the table? So Norman Rockwell is the master of really Americana from this era. He's the guy that invented Rosie. Rosie's not real, but she is truly symbolic of the woman in the labor force. So Rosie's here with her goggles on, eating her sandwich. She's got her wristwatch. She's got her propaganda buttons on her overalls, her lunch pail, her rivet gun, and as she's taking a rest for lunch, she's got her feet propped up on a copy of Mein Kampf. A lot of symbolism going on in that depiction of Rosie. The OWI, the Office on War Information, they're going to pick up, they're going to issue that version of Rosie. We Can Do It. That becomes one of the most important pieces of propaganda during the war, and it's still pretty iconic today. Again, another piece of propaganda, women in the war, we can't win without them. Women win wars, and American women must always be remembered and credited for their work in wartime industry and factories, who were replacing men who were all fighting in the war. Here we have the Army Nurse Corps. My great aunt Marge, she worked in the Army Nurse Corps during the war. woman's place in war, the Women's Army Corps, here on the right. And they served all over the place. They served at home and on all fronts. Women also played baseball during the war. Most baseball players by 42 and 43 were off the war. I talked about the two iconic players that went to serve during the war effort. We talked about Joe DiMaggio, Ted Williams. So women are going to stay home, and a lot of women are going to play baseball, and that will lead to women traveling around playing professional baseball. Has anybody seen that film? Yeah, if you haven't seen it, check it out. League of Their Own is pretty awesome. So African American contributions are tremendously important. Minorities are going to run on what is called the Double V campaign. Has anybody ever heard of A. Philip Randolph before? He's tremendously important. He's the guy that inspires Dr. King in the civil rights movement. He leads the modern civil rights movement during the World War II era. So it's victory at war, victory at home for civil rights. Most African Americans were serving in non-combat roles. All African American regiments were segregated and they were under white leadership. Some of these were actually, their officers were specifically picked out as to be Southerners, which created some tension, especially with the 92nd Buffalo Soldiers who served in Italy, because most of their commanding officers were all from Virginia or the Deep South. The Tuskegee Airmen and the 92nd, those are the regiments that served in the most fixed combat in large numbers. So you're on the top left, African American soldiers training. Top right, the 92nd Buffalo Soldiers. Bottom left, African American man working in the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. And the bottom right, that's the insignia of the 92nd Buffalo Soldiers. First African American Marine recruit was William Baldwin. He was recruited and enlisted in the Marine Corps during World War II. The Tuskegee Airmen, they fought in two groups. The 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bomber Group. Again, these guys were trained at Tuskegee because there was already what type of aviation program at Tuskegee. What is Tuskegee? It is a place. Very good. What type of place? It is a southern place. What do we remember about Tuskegee and Booker T. Washington? What's that? Very good. Excellent work, Donovan. It is a vocational and technical education school in Tuskegee, Alabama, founded by Booker T. Washington, who was one of their really famous professors for science and botany. Think peanuts and sweet potatoes. Very good. George Washington Carver. Tuskegee didn't just have vocation in farming, they also had technical programs in aviation. Why? What type of aviation program would Tuskegee have? What's that? That's a good guess, but that's not what I'm looking for. Cargo is not what I'm looking for. Looking for something connected to agriculture.
Crop dusting?
Yeah, they had a crop dusting program there, right? So, okay, let's keep it on the rails, guys. All right, so totally inappropriate. So moving right along, they already had. This is like one of the only African American institutions that already has an aviation program in place. And when you think about that, what's really important to think about is not only the pilots, but you have to also think about the mechanics. You have to think about the facility The list kind of goes on and on. So that was the sort of the no-brainer for these guys to train there. The first combat that they're going to actually see is going to be in North Africa and in Italy. The majority of the combat that they see will be in Italy. In fact, they flew as not only envoys, which means they escorted bomber units in, but they were also some of the first fighter group. They were one of the first fighter groups to actually battle the Emmy Messerschmitt, the jet plane the Germans developed by the end of the war. They won 3 major unit citations, one in which came from the bombing campaign at Monte Cassino in 1944. Here we have the Tuskegee Airmen, also known as the Red Tails. Anybody ever seen that film? It's pretty decent. A little bit Hollywood, you know. Yeah.
Wait, so you said they were about the
Yeah. Well, a number of them were shot down, but they were that good a pilot. I mean, they had Mustangs by the end of the war, so they got a lot of credibility during it. Yeah.
One of the tricks that allied pilots used to keep down the Messerschmitt was it was one of the most dangerous planes in the sky when it was, just cruising, but on takeoff and landing, it was very unstable and it didn't have good handling characteristics at low speed, so lots of times the allied pilot would try to keep them down when they knew that the Messerschmitt was going to take off.
That's cool. I didn't know that. It's good to know. So here we have members of the Tuskegee fighter group. Really important African American to talk about during this era, Staff Sergeant Edward A. Carter, member of the 7th Army Infantry in Germany on March 23rd, 1945. He heroically acted when a tank raid that he was involved in was hit by bazooka fire. He dismounted the tank, led 3 soldiers across an open field. 2 of the men were killed and the other seriously wounded. Carter continued alone, was wounded 5 times before being forced to take cover. 8 German soldiers tried to capture him, but he killed 6 and captured the remaining 2. He used the 2 captured Germans as shields from enemy fire as he crossed the field. His prisoners provided valuable information for his unit, and he is the first African American, he's not the first African American. He is the first African American in World War II to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. There have been previous African American medal winners from previous wars. He's the first in World War II. Sadly, he never received the award because he had passed away. His family was posthumously granted the Medal of Honor by President Bill Clinton in 1997. No, he went on to serve after World War II. I think he served in Korea and Vietnam. Yeah, he kept on fighting after the war. That is Staff Sergeant Edward A. Carter. I wanted to pull Edward A. Carter into the lesson because there was this bogus idea at the start of the war that African Americans weren't going to be able to fight, and then they fought because people were insanely racist, and people would make claims that they would be cowards and they didn't have the mental capacity to fight, and that's what made the 92nd. The 92nd probably has the most difficult story in World War II because they served proudly and they were given these insane missions and they still followed through with them. But their commanders, when they would win battles, the commanders wouldn't report the victories. But when they would lose battles, they would report the losses, and blame the African American units. And a number of the African Americans that fought the 92nd said it literally took everything for them not to kill their own officers. Because they were that, like, there was that much tension. But it wasn't like that with everybody. Like the Tuskegee, they had that level of racism early on, but like this is coming from multiple sort of like multiple avenues. But like for me, I personally met a guy who fought in Italy. He's a white guy from New York. He moved to Midlothian. He won the Distinguished Flying Cross. And so I interviewed this guy, and he was like, no one had respect for them until these bombing raids at Anzio and Monte Cassino. And they flew the escorts, like they were the envoy escort. And he said they were like the toughest pilots that anyone served with in Italy. And they were so fearless that by the time those campaigns were over, that a lot of the white pilots just gained a lot of respect for them, because it was if you're fighting on the ground or in the air, it's insanely dangerous. But so much of the Italian campaign required air support, even more so than North Africa. So in North Africa, they had difficulty getting a lot of respect early on. The 92nd, it was like those guys could never gain the respect they deserved. And most of the 92nd guys that won like Medals of Honor, those Medals of Honor were not issued until the Bush and Obama administration, like second Bush and Obama administration. Here's what we're looking at. This is the Double V campaign in action. So a lot of folks moved to cities like Detroit, Norfolk, to work in the war industries, to get jobs at plants. But again, they campaigned for victory in war, victory at home, led by A. Philip Randolph and the NAACP. This is a march that's saying, says race discrimination breeds fascism. Again, despite the improved economic opportunities, African Americans still suffered discrimination in housing and other areas. In Detroit, tensions erupted in a full-scale riot in the summer of 1943, where 34 people were killed as a result of the riots. Speaking of riots, I want to talk a little bit about the Zoot Suit riots. Mexican Americans were also targeted in race-related hate crimes and riots during the war years. The Zoot Suit riots were a series of riots in 1943 that erupted in Los Angeles. Zoot Suits were banned because they used too much fabric. They weren't just popular with Latinos. Everybody liked the Zoot Suit. You know what a Zoot Suit looked like? It's like a super baggy pants and a long jacket. They usually wear like, they actually made a weird comeback in the 90s. And it was like, that was fast. It did not hang on. I've got another clip of Snafu that I'm going to show you today, where this guy's marching and he's wearing a Zoot Suit. So this is kind of a sad situation. It led to the death of Jose Diaz. A group of Latinos were wearing Zoot Suits in LA, and a group of sailors targeted those Latinos wearing Zoot Suits, and then it became like this racist thing of like only Latinos were wearing Zoot Suits. That wasn't the deal. Like other people were wearing them, but they were illegal to wear because of the rationing for the war effort. So it turned into this massive mob fighting in LA, and the incident triggered similar attacks against Latinos in other major cities who were continuing to wear Zoot Suits during the war. You have a question or a comment? Okay, cool. So again, wartime rationing regulations, that's what a Zoot Suit looked like. Led to the ban of Zoot Suits because they used too much fabric. So it's a combination of patriotism, racism, that led white soldiers to label the Mexican American Zoot Suit folks as hoodlums, and it also led to anti-Mexican riots in other parts of the country. Do keep in mind there are other important groups that we've discussed before. The Navajo Code Talkers, tremendously important for their contribution to the war effort. Mexican Americans did not fight in segregated units. A lot of Mexican Americans on the West Coast served in the Marine Corps, Army, places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa. The Nisai Regiment was the most decorated regiment in American military history. 21 medals of honor, triple-digit individual medals, Purple Hearts, Bronze Stars, Silver Stars, numerous unit citations. And again, you got to keep in mind that the war effort really came from all segments of American society. So we have our Navajo Code Talkers. The nearly 200 Navajo Code Talkers helped maintain security by transmitting orders in a Navajo code, and the Japanese were unable to break. And again, Andrew and Robin, good reflection and research earlier that none of our Navajo Code Talkers were captured. Mexican American soldiers. And then let's talk a little bit more about the 442nd. Their motto was "Go for Broke." All Japanese American unit, they served in Europe out of fear that if they served in the Pacific, they may be tortured by the Japanese if they were captured. The 442nd was a self-sufficient fighting force, fought with distinction in Italy, southern France, and Germany. The unit became the most highly decorated regiment during the war. Numerous unit citations, 21 medals of honor recipients, and over 100 individual medals. Again, their motto, "Go for Broke." Here are the Nisei first and second generation Japanese soldiers. And the real tragic thing for the Nisei is that while they're fighting abroad, their families are interned. So 110,000 Japanese Americans were interned west of the Mississippi through FDR's Executive Order 9066. This executive order was upheld. You guys were responsible in Addison's class for Korematsu versus the United States. Okay.
Are we actually?
You are? Good. So, excellent. Korematsu versus the United States. Korematsu, Japanese American, challenged Executive Order 9066, and this is one of the most controversial Supreme Court decisions in this era because the Supreme Court upheld the decision to intern the Japanese west of the Mississippi. There are double-digit internment camps. They are not labor camps. They are not concentration camps. They are somewhere in between refugee camps and Native American reservations. They are on desolate pieces of land. They do attempt to try to grow their own food, but they lost their private property. They lost their homes. They lost their businesses. They lost their possessions. A public apology was not issued until 1988 by President Ronald Reagan, and reparations were not paid until the Clinton and Bush administrations to those family members who had survived. Internment occurred from 1942 to 1945. It led to strong anti-Japanese prejudice and resentment in the West Coast and all over the country. Of the roughly 110,000 that were interned, does anybody have any idea how many spies were found?
Yeah.
0. No spies were ever uncovered from Japanese internment. Here's several of the larger internment camps. There are smaller internment camps that were sprinkled all over the West Coast, or basically west of Mississippi, mostly on the West Coast. Again, on the top right, we've got a bird's eye view of what internment looked like. Bottom right, these are Japanese Americans being processed for internment. Posters were put up in California instructing people of Japanese descent, citizens and non-citizens alike to report to the Civil Patrol station to be deported to the camps. This is a Japanese American girl waiting with her family's belongings to be evacuated to an internment camp. So here we have Canal Camp in Arizona. Did anybody read Letters from Manzanar? And did you read that? No. Have you heard of it? It's a book. It's a book written about a young girl's experience in the internment camp on the top right. Crystal Creek, Texas. And then you have Gila, Arizona on the bottom right. So again, Japanese internment on December 17, 1944. General Henry C. Pratt issued public proclamation number 21, declaring that effective on January 2nd, 1945, Japanese American evacuees from the West Coast would return to their homes, but a lot of them actually lost their property during this process. During the course of World War II, 10 Americans were convicted of spying. None of them were of Japanese ancestry. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill to recompensate each surviving internee with a tax-free check for $20,000 and an apology from the U.S. government, and that was paid over over the Bush and Clinton administration. Reagan, Bush, Clinton. So how did America change on the war front after entry into World War II? Fear and racism against Japanese Americans led to internment. Women and minorities found new employment opportunities. The Great Depression was finally over. Does anybody remember that I talk about how low employment got? Unemployment? No, how low, like it was at 25% during the Depression and 50% among African Americans. How low does it get during World War II? 2. It's 2%. Okay? So the New Deal, we have to look at, if we want to look at the New Deal objectively, we can look at the good, bad, and the ugly. The New Deal only helped by about 10%. During the New Deal, unemployment only got down to 15%. However, it's important to add that the New Deal also, there were a lot of programs that failed. There were a lot of programs that were unconstitutional. So it didn't work out completely. So if you want to really look at, you know, what brought the Great Depression to an end, it's truly World War II. After the war, America abandoned isolationism and took on the role as a larger role globally. And then obviously African Americans are still fighting for civil rights, and this leads to the birth of the modern civil rights movement.